of course, we know we now need more internet connectivity. That's the obvious. I'm trying to get to some of the more clear lessons. One is a focus on quality. A second is about technology. Third is adoption barriers, utilization patterns. I'm really apologize. We've gone an entire 4 hours without using the word network neutrality. I will introduce the term here, unfortunately, and I'll talk about other interventions that different countries have done. So quickly, to me, one of the most interesting pivots in the pandemic has made clear is a need for a lot of policy which is focused on increasing connectivity and lowering prices to shift to broadband quality. You hear a lot of stories, I'm thinking particularly for a European audience, that there are a number of European countries that have struggled to support video during the pandemic for educational purposes and the like, to upload videos recorded by students to participate in different ways. And then we discovered that this is part of a broader trend in economics where they used to just focus on price and quantity. And we're now understanding that quality is a different dimension of competition, and in fact is one that is vitally important. This is also a technical aspect. You know, the first generation of broadband was reconditioning legacy infrastructures, twisted pair and coax, fairly cheap, but also didn't have to worry about things like investment incentives so much because those were largely built out and fully amortized. Now what we're seeing in a quality competition is a fundamentally different dimension, which is people are having to invest in greenfields. But in addition, we're seeing a lack of differences in technologies used. The product is not just single dimensional. I've got some work that looks at how traditional regulation has worked best. And when the product varies along different dimensions of quality, it's actually very, very hard to do for governments to do on government provisioning and also for traditional regulatory tools to use. And what we're seeing is an increasing heterogeneity in the demands people are playing. And so what we're seeing now is you see this more in the US than in Europe, is there's a different form of competition where people are not trying to beat down price, but they're trying to compete by offering better quality. And particularly, I see this also as part of the maturation of the industry. When broadband was greenfield, that is, you're trying to get people from dial-up and to get them to broadband as new users, competition takes a certain form. But if you actually have everyone already on broadband and you're trying to then shift them from one existing broadband provider to another, you have to provide them with a value-added reason to switch. And that, in fact, the nature becomes what we call competition becomes intensive instead of extensive. And that, in fact, you'll see a great deal more of product differentiation. You'll see quality improvements, process improvements. And there's a whole literature on how this is going to change. And that, in fact, the regulatory tools really aren't oriented that way. I mean, they're very much oriented towards possibilities of infrastructure sharing, which is going to just, by its nature, reduces competition to that of price. Because any infrastructure investments in quality wouldn't necessarily have to be shared. But what we're going to see as we talk about this is this is going to play out somewhat differently in areas that have service in urban areas versus rural areas. And I'll talk about that on my next slide at some greater depth. So what's interesting is what really strikes me, and to some extent I see this in European audiences, people fall in love with particular technologies. For generations, it's been fiber. You know, we've been hearing about ultra broadband. And, you know, I always point out that it's not clear fiber to the home is a business case that's sold out. I mean, you see use cases that are actually based on user data. Nobody actually needs a gig and subscription rates are extremely low, but the carriers seem to have caught themselves in a marketing battle that if you're not offering a gig, you're perceived as deficient. I always talk about, you know, people talk about the chicken and egg problem. I always point to Japan, which is basically forced legacy copper users to subsidize a national fiber build out. They have the chicken, there is no egg. There has not emerged that sort of set of apps, and this is going to come along. And as we know, it's not just the apps, the whole ecosystem. It's only as effective as the slowest link. It's got to be in transit. It's got to be in last mile. It's got to be in servers. It's got to be in everything. The other thing I hear, I love people talking about 5G all the time. And especially striking is fiber and 5G are often said, oh, that'll solve the digital divide. 5G and rural, by its nature and the small cell deployments is just not a rural solution. Fiber, generally because of the density problems, is not a different solution. But more importantly, we should be talking about mixes of technologies. There's no single technology that's going to solve the problem. I've done increasing work in rural US, And even in rural areas, the villages are relatively easy to serve. The ring around the villages are more difficult but possible. And it's really the hyper-rural areas that are a different problem. So even within the rural problem, we need to think about these differently. I'm doing some study work now on fixed wireless for hyper-rural areas. People say it's not as good. We all understand that. But the alternative to that is not fiber quality. The alternative in many of these places is nothing at all. And what I define, by the way, is the relationship between the companies and the cities is very different in these areas. We think of them as adversaries in many places. The cities are begging companies to get interested in serving them, and it's a very different relationship. I'm also a little frustrated by how, like, the weather balloons and the drones and all this, who get all this publicity. We learned from the disaster relief attempts to deploy them. They haven't been terribly successful. What I'm discovering is things like cellular and Wi-Fi and just boring old technologies have proven much more effective in the empirical work we've done in connecting more people to the internet than the fancy stuff. And I find that a lot of people have taken COVID to try to argue for symmetric bandwidth. There was a good argument when peer-to-peer was 70% of the bandwidth. I'd like to make this evidence-based. Yes, we're uploading more in video, but it's still the smallest number I've seen is 6-to-1. I've seen 13-to-1 on the data, just on the stuff that's published. And public broadband, yes, there's more demand for broadband, but the issues still surround it. It's not like, okay, we need more broadband, therefore we should go to solutions that we're not sure are right. They still have to be analyzed on an evidence base and make sure they're going to work. The big missing part of much of the debate is if you build it, they will come is false. That in fact, every survey in the developing world, this includes the US, the UK, EU, also in other third world countries, to say that there's a huge adoption problem and that in fact it's not taken, and that in fact most regulators are comfortable with the supply side, that is price and availability. They ignore the side and they put out incomplete solutions that don't work. A big issue has largely been relevance, which is surprises. I think that we are technophiles and snobs on the academic side, and we have blind spots. But in fact, for a large part of the country, they're not sure they need it. And in fact, the question is, has COVID moved that needle? In fact, and for how long? Is it going to be permanent? Is it uniform across the board? And in fact, we're seeing this may still need to be validated. The two huge other issues are digital skills, privacy, and security. Our understanding of what's required for digital skills is shockingly primitive. We don't know what needs to be taught. We don't know the right way to deliver it in terms of online, in-person, frequency, and in fact, and sharing of curriculum. All of this needs to go very far. In addition, there's huge gender digital divide problems looking below this. Low income is obvious, and in fact, it's pretty clear that that COVID's had a very negative impact on low-income populations, and this is part of the general globalism fight. Generally, the tech economy is leaving people behind. It's been accelerated by COVID. Gender has been worse, and shockingly, even absent COVID, as we close the digital divide, the gender digital divide has worsened, not gotten better. And technophiles like to think that this would be a rising tide that would float all boats. As it turns out, that's not the case. And in fact, COVID's made it much worse for women. They tend to fill roles in the economy that tend to be lost. They tend to be having demands placed on them aside from that are very difficult. COVID has created a lot of new utilization patterns. It's obvious what we're doing today: work, healthcare, education. There's some good to this. There's a lot of more broader experimentation with ed tech. The problem is we need better tools. Healthcare tech too, and a lot of regulatory barriers have been overcome temporarily. And we're learning that it's actually a better way to deliver a lot of healthcare, and you don't need to physically see a doctor for everything. The new tools, for education is a good example. All we've done is ported it over. We still just give lectures online. The beauty of EdTech is the ability to customize learning to individuals and be responsive in ways that we've always wanted to do but never been able to do immediate evaluation, immediate feedback. There's just things, we need tools, healthcare tools, but more importantly, you can't just get the tools, you have to give the training to the instructors, you have to give support, you have to divide into the curriculum and the materials. But interestingly, there's a whole bunch of administrative stuff that has to support education, but social mechanisms and the places where we've seen mHealth deployed broadly. For example, there's a relationship between doctors and nurses, which is very complex, that has to be supported and changed. And it's not just dropping new connectivity and new tools in as well. We need to validate what the impact is. We're actually working on a case study here in Philadelphia to try to look at mHealth solutions and broadband connectivity to find the correlations in successful completion, to try to find impacts. And in fact, that in many ways people say is sort of the missing link, in the sense that People don't get broadband for its own sake. It's what does it give you in terms of education, healthcare, economic, and financial inclusion, and the like. And that, in fact, what we're going to see is you're going to see a lot of analysis of trying to become more granular about work and education. As you know, a lot of companies have said they're not going back to the office. We're seeing that, in fact, there's some studies that showed people maintain their productivity. It's not clear that's true for all forms of work, and it's not clear that certain functions are going to work very well. So for an easy one, onboarding new personnel. We've leveraged existing social relationships that we built from the workplace through March. How far is that going to go in terms of that when you lose the informal interactions, team building work as opposed to routine stuff? And it's pretty clear young elementary education is suffering much worse from distance education. And in fact, some countries have admitted this entire year as a lost year. Quick things about net neutrality. One of the more interesting questions is there are two big examples. EU, and not just the EU, but other countries have requested Netflix and Google to throttle video by dropping it back from high definition to SD. And a lot of countries and carriers have zero-rated educational and health content. And under the current environment, that's probably been really helpful. Generally regarded as good. What's interesting is the need to throttle streaming video. There's some ambiguity in the data as to whether it was in fact necessary. But to still use it as an example, if it were necessary, video is 60% of primetime traffic, and the HD SD trick works for certain applications, but not for others. And what's interesting here is you can see what is a non-neutral solution in terms of apps being provided that actually solves the problem in a pragmatic sort of way. And in a world where adding more bandwidth on a reasonable time frame really wasn't an option. And what's interesting is, should we take this off the table? Is this validating the needs for possible doing this? But on a longer term basis, the substitution for OpEx for CapEx is a lingering problem. And what we're discovering is that, in fact, the economics may favor some of these things. It's an interesting study question to say that, in my mind, are there conditions under which these sorts of interventions may make sense? And I'll finish a little early, just in the interest of saving a little more time for discussion. There are other responses, just so you know, that governments and providers have taken: opening Wi-Fi hotspots for free, temporary allocations of spectrum, pledges not to disconnect customers, which is becoming increasingly problematic as this has lengthened longer than we thought. Forcing companies to carry insolvent customers is going to have a cost, and there's no question about that. And there's been actually general use of subsidies and SIM card subsidized service and giving away SIM cards that have been a very interesting intervention that's been beneficial. That is part of this, the COVID response as well.